The question of when to go back to work is one that almost all of us long haulers will have to face at some point. And my recent study showing that over 90% of long haulers were still unable to work as they could pre-COVID shows the scale of the problem. In this episode of our expert interviews series, Dr. Asad Khan and I talked to an expert panel about how long haulers can navigate their return to work successfully, what they should ask their boss for, and what they should do to give themselves the best chance of avoiding relapse. I hope you find it helpful. So could we start with just some short introductions, please? And we'll start going across the top of my screen, so starting with Jenny.
Yes, hello, I'm Jenny Ceolta-Smith. I'm an occupational therapist by background. I'm also experienced in vocational rehabilitation in terms of practice, policy and research. Prior to becoming ill with COVID in March 2020, I was working as an occupational therapy lecturer 4 days a week, and I'd gone back to practice working in the job centre as an occupational health professional.
Hi, I'm Emily. I'm a junior doctor, and throughout the last year I've worked in acute med and ITU with a lot of COVID patients, and I am also the disability and wellbeing rep for the West Mids BMA for kind of junior doctors, and I have a background in health coaching with a particular interest in fatigue and a personal experience of living with POTS, although not from long COVID.
Hi, I'm Jasmine. I'm an occupational therapist. I work in an outpatient department where our core business would normally be musculoskeletal conditions, but we started to see patients with COVID back in June through our staff service and have continued to do so. I think we've had around 160, 170 referrals into our service. I've been qualified for around 8 years and did a post-grad MSc in vocational rehab. It's an interest of mine. And whilst we wouldn't claim to be experts in this by any means, I think we've learned quite a lot along the way with regard to returning to work.
Hi, I'm Clare Rayner. I'm an occupational physician, although retired on ill health grounds prior to COVID. But I've still been very much involved in the world of occupational health. And I also teach communication skills and other things like that.
So Claire, you've recently spoken about your concerns for those off with long COVID for a prolonged period. So people who aren't in work for a prolonged period. Could you tell us a bit more about your concerns?
I think it's a concern in general that anybody who's off work for more than a few weeks even, it can be very difficult to get back to work. People do and they can, but it starts to impact on all sorts of other things like confidence, and you get secondary problems. So we know even before COVID that certainly if you're off for a few months and up to a year, that's a big mountain to climb to come back into work, and it needs a lot of support. My concern now is that 16 months into the pandemic, we have so many people who have been off sick for over a year, and so even it's just a horrendous amount of people, and for each individual just such a huge mountain to climb. So those are my main concerns. We know that being workless, as they put it, is really detrimental to health overall.
Obviously, some people have to go back to work when finances dictate that. But if you're able to actually choose when to go back to work, at what point should people, maybe who are recovering from long COVID, consider going back to work? Because they're probably not waiting till they're completely symptom-free. It's somewhere on the spectrum of recovery before that. So at what point should people is it reasonable for people to start thinking of doing so?
I think it's completely an individual thing. That's the first thing I would say. So it's very difficult to give any hard and fast rules. I think what's important is to keep in contact with the workplace. It's a small but very important thing. And so it keeps that communication open, because I think there is benefit when the person feels able to do something to go back doing those some things. It's far better.
I think one of the things that we found is particularly helpful if people have a degree of consistency from day to day. We find that in the beginning, early stages, and when I say early stages, this can be months and months for some people, that they have quite significant fluctuations. So their bad days can be very severe, where they're struggling to get out of bed. They can be quite frequent, maybe a couple of times a week, but they perhaps receive some treatment, as they may have a better understanding of symptom management. Those fluctuations might still exist, but they might be less severe, they might be less frequent. And even on a bad day, people at some point, most people are remaining functional to an extent in light day-to-day tasks. And I think it's very difficult to plan a phased return if you're completely different from day to day, because the workplace dictates a degree of predictability. So I would say consistency is quite important, and also feeling well in yourself. If you're feeling generally still very poorly, you're very symptomatic, then it's not a good idea to start considering work. There are lots of other factors as well. What kind of job you have, how that job matches to the symptoms that you have will all dictate how soon someone can go back to work. Also, how flexible an employer can be.
Yeah, I was just going to ask Emily. I mean, the NHS is the country's largest employer. What's their attitude to this sort of thing in terms of understanding, and what's your experience been in terms of working with people who are, trying this?
I think it's hugely varied, and I think Claire will probably echo this, is it really depends a lot on the occupational health service within your hospital, which can be anything from an absolutely dedicated, really understanding occupational health consultant who will work to put in enough adaptations for you and phase it in, understanding the fatigue, the need to try things and test, to other hospitals where even just getting access to an occupational health appointment will be incredibly hard, or the person you get will, really be quite kind of stand back from actually supporting you forward. And again, the role that you're in will affect how much you can do. I think being able to start back in some way, doing something that you are able to contribute, where you feel like you're getting back into the workplace, either kind of virtually or in real terms, can be really helpful, for your own sense of self-worth as well, and actually for distraction from symptoms. And I don't mean that in the sense that some symptoms you can't be distracted from, and some symptoms, of course, actually are made worse by the activity. But there is something to be said for an activity or some work in your head that keeps you away from, to some degree, thinking about your symptoms. So I think it's that balance, isn't it? And the NHS is still needing to work a lot towards this. One thing that we've proposed, I think we're a long way off getting it, is the equivalent of keeping in touch days that we see for people who are on maternity leave or parental leave. Having those for people with disability or health conditions, we think would be really helpful.
Jenny, is there anything you'd say about people who, what's the first thing that people should do once they think about going back to work? Is there almost like a checklist of like, oh, I better do this, I better do that?
There's multiple things. I think that, the first point of call really is your GP, who's going to have been tracking your progress. We have what's called the fit note. So somebody may be still deemed as unfit for work, but through discussions with the GP, knowing what medical treatments and investigations, that somebody's undertaking, they may be deemed maybe fit for work. And that then opens the door for the conversation with the employer. We've got occupational health as well, which Claire will be able to talk a lot about. So I think there are multiple things that somebody would need to do, really. In my case, I think I took a very proactive approach for my first return to work. And as I've gone on through my journey, I think it's really important that people are aware of other schemes like Access to Work, which is funded by the Department for Work and Pensions. So Access to Work can do an assessment for somebody before they go back to work or while they're in work if they've got health condition or disability, and they can put into place lots of things that might help that person to looking at their job. So I think there's a whole range, but I think the GP generally, I mean, we've also got services like Jasmine and long COVID clinics where there's professionals. We would hope that they will be looking at work, and we know that indeed some of those are, like the servicing leads. So I think that there are multiple avenues, but I think for most people, my impression is it's going to be the GP at the moment, because we know lots of people are still waiting for access to consultants and other services.
So, Jenny, just staying with you, you've had more than one return to work attempt, haven't you? And you know, being an occupational therapist, this is what you help other people do as your role. And I know some of your experiences were less positive than others. Could you perhaps tell us what went well and what didn't in each of the instances?
I think, as I've sort of mentioned, that I took a proactive approach because of my background and my research, echoing the things that Claire said. I was very aware that being off work, my confidence, my self-efficacy would diminish my mental health. And sort of 4 months on in my journey with long COVID, I did start to feel a little bit better. So I'd only had then the GP kind of support to get me back to work, and obviously discussed that with my employer. My employers were very supportive, but I followed more in line of the traditional phased return to work. I certainly didn't have the volume of work that I would usually have, but that period of time of trying to increase too quickly, which is now, you know, we've got more consensus that doing things too much too soon can in some cases lead to a relapse. So that didn't work for me, that first phased return, and I had to make that decision to leave that. I'd also at the time was having some treatment for insomnia that actually was very contraindicated. I was advised to have sleep restriction, so that really impacted on my health and well-being within the workplace. So the second phased return, I had occupational health. That was several months later, and their recommendations were very gradual, 1 to 4 hours a week, and it was all working from home with gradual increase in time and work, and that was over about 8 weeks. But I found again, after the sort of Christmas period, other aspects of my daily life were really impacted, and again I had to withdraw from the workplace. I think now I'm in a much better position, and I've learned a lot more, as what Jasmine's saying, to learn how to manage my symptoms. I'm still waiting for some investigations, but I've now had access to work. I've had occupational health again. I've got much more awareness from the long COVID clinic as well, with the support from physio, the dietitian, and the occupational therapist. So I think having lots of appropriate people involved to enable me to see how I may manage. Then comes the discussion with the employer again, because in my view now, what I've had to come to terms with and accept is that I cannot do the full hours that I would be contracted for. That's a very big personal decision in terms of finances. So if my employer agrees to the reasonable adjustments, the working from home, all of those aspects, and a temporary change of contract, then I may be successful in getting back to work. But you know, it's a financial hit, which brings financial stress. So that will possibly impact on the work situation as well. So I think I've learned, I think it's a personal journey, and you've got to look at matching your own symptoms of long COVID with the job. It's going to depend on what tasks I'm given at work, whether I can work at home, and whether there's the intersection of those aspects around the environment and the work that I can manage. I don't know if that answers your question. I don't know if that.
Yes, it does. Yes, it does. Thank you, Jenny. I've got a question for Claire, actually. What conversations should people have with their employers before attempting to return to work? And what can employers do for them that helps the process?
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I was going to add that to what Jenny was saying, actually, that I think one of the first things that people should do when considering a return to work, obviously with their GP, but actually should have that conversation early on with their manager or HR person or somebody that they that is managing them in the workplace. That initial conversation is really important. What should they ask for? Again, it's going to be an individual thing. I hate to keep coming back to that, but it could depend on what combination of health problems the person's got, but more to the point, what the effects on their function is. So in occupational health, we're really not very bothered about labels. It's what problems has this person got and what's the impact on their function. So it's to tell the manager what you can or can't do. And I think that's the most important thing. You don't have to give any clinical information away to your managers, but what they will understand is what you can or can't do. And if there are any things that you know yourself would aggravate your symptoms that you've had with the long COVID, say those, because those are the things that you need a workaround. So even if it's a meeting just to have some initial discussion, COVID specific, this virus is a beast, as my infectious disease consultant said. And I think in the first place, people need adequate rest, for the first few weeks, ideally until the symptoms have settled of the acute phase. But then it's got to be gradual. And I think what we're finding, and Jasmine said the same, is that it's a slow phased return compared to normal. And this is not unusual with other conditions. It's just that we've got a whole load of people together. So in terms of what can the manager do, the list of what we call adjustments is as long as you can possibly imagine. I found in clinical practice that quite often if you were saying to people, where do you think you're at the moment? And what would you like to do at this point in time? They might say, well, I really want to come back to work, but I'm too tired or I'm not getting enough sleep. So then you would focus on that problem. And then the sort of third question is, second question is, how confident do you feel? If that's an issue, you can address that. And then thirdly, what do you think might help you get back into work? It sounds very simple, but it actually is a question that yields so much. I find that within the first 5 minutes of a consultation, you can get straight to a plan, because the person yourself, don't you?
Yeah, so just thinking about how you approach your employer when you're asking for adjustments, something from my coaching background that I think can be really helpful, both for how you feel, but also how those adjustments and suggestions are received, is thinking about focusing on what it is that you need rather than what it is you can't do. And whilst there is a degree of needing to spell out what you cannot do and have clear boundaries, actually turning it into a positive suggestion that emphasizes how, for example, instead of saying how awful and dizzy and sick I feel in the mornings, saying I'm much better in the afternoons and evenings, and I find I'm really productive in the evenings. Could we change my hours? Could I come in if I start at 10, I can actually manage to do a whole day. Whereas if I start at 9, I think I'm going to struggle, but coming back to that positive. And especially for people with long COVID, if you've not had a health condition before, you're understandably likely to be quite focused on the detrimental effects that it's having on you and how rubbish you're feeling. And being able to stop and put it down in writing sometimes, or practice with somebody else what it is you want and why it's beneficial for you, and therefore for your employer, because ultimately if it helps you to stay at work, be more productive, whatever it is, then you're selling it to them. It's kind of, think about it like political spin, you know, there's a way of saying it. So the other thing that I would strongly advise, and I think this applies outside of work as well, is catch yourself when you're apologizing. Stop saying sorry. Everybody does it in Britain, but if you've got a health condition, you're likely to do it an awful lot. And actually, again, both you and the person receiving that are likely to feel worse. If somebody makes an adjustment for you, whether that's, I find at work, people will offer me a seat if I come in, and if I'm not using my wheelchair, I come in, someone will offer me a seat. I could say, oh, sorry, you know, or I can say thank you. If I say thank you, they get to be the little mini hero. They get to be positive. I feel good. They feel good. That kind of interaction sets up how you feel in your workplace and how people think about you as well. It makes it feel less like you're the sick one. And it's just actually everyone's working together and looking out for each other. And my final point on the kind of coaching language type thing is when you're asking for a request, and this definitely applies when you're talking to HR, is if they say we don't normally do that, well, that's not how we usually do things, that is your flag to very quietly but firmly think to yourself, usually, normally does not mean it can't be done. And in the same way as if somebody says that we haven't done that before, that's not the same as we can't do that. But usually, normally means, okay, this is different for them, this is different for you, it's different for everybody. But if you offer them a suggestion and say, okay, I know you don't usually have people start at this time, or you don't usually allow people to wear noise cancelling headphones because of perception, whatever it is, but actually this, again, coming back to the first point, doing this will allow me to be a better employee and manage my health, you'll have better luck and hopefully also feel more positive about yourself.
Those are phenomenal practical tips, Emily. Thank you so much. I mean, you know, we've all heard we don't normally do that, you know, oh, you're the first person to ask for that. So really good tips about turning that into something positive. Jasmine, we've talked off the record, Jess, please edit that bit out, okay? We've talked off the record about, because the energy envelope varies from day to day. And also because the traditional phased return, which is 4 weeks, is not appropriate in most cases of long COVID. Certain adaptations have to be made to the return to work program. Could you talk us through what's been useful in your experience?
There are lots of things that can be really helpful. I think in one way, following on from what people were saying of what employers can do, is I think approach things quite flexibly. It's very difficult for people to explain what they can and can't do, especially because of the fluctuating nature. And I agree that it's really important to stay focused on how that affects your ability to do things rather than diagnosis. A lot of managers would be quite intimidated by some diagnosis. They might not know what certain terminology means, and it wouldn't help them implement things. But I think in some ways it's really difficult to predict how someone will respond to adjusted duties in a phased return. And I think having that flexibility, having regular meetings and being open to think that this hasn't been a failure the first week, if it's been difficult, but actually what can we do to reassess this and change things a little bit. There are things as a phased return that I think are really helpful. So again, like you mentioned, I think they are needing to extend beyond a traditional 4-week period. Our trust is allowing that to happen, which is really great for us. I think things like non-consecutive days can be really helpful for as long as possible, because it allows people to have that recovery time, which seems so essential. I think even if you do adjusted duties, some people still feel that they need that extended recovery, especially as people continue through the phased return. I think there is always an expectation, even if it's not expected too quickly, that there is an increase in hours or there is an increase in duties, and people will still need to recover in response to those increases. So non-consecutive days, having breaks are really important, I think. the other things I think are making sure that the light duties that you and your manager choose to do are appropriate to the symptoms that you have. Some people might be okay with heavier lifting, but they might really struggle to bend down and stand back up, or they might struggle to stand for prolonged periods of times. In which case the light duties are very different. And I think something that people could maybe do, going back to what we were saying earlier, in the run-up of going back to work, is to maybe simulate some of the things that they might need to do at work. So sometimes things like using a computer might seem pretty easy. And even if you've not done it during sickness absence, which lots of people might not have, it can sometimes catch them off guard a little bit as to actually how energy consuming that might be. So I think if people can simulate some of the things that they do at work, whether they are doing bending down to the floor, whether they are climbing ladders, whether they're using a computer, whether they're listening to meetings and trying to write minutes at the same time. I think it's really important for people to try and expose themselves to those things a little bit, so that when they do go to their manager, they're a little bit more informed, and maybe quantifying things a little bit as well. When I ask, oh, how long can you spend on your feet, people will come back to me and say, oh, less than I used to, or not very long. And not very long can range from 3 minutes to 3 hours, depending on what people would normally do. So I think if people can go with some kind of quantifiable information, some numbers of how long can they tolerate things, it makes it much easier for a manager then to put limits in place, to know how long someone might manage a shift, and to look at potentially as well to maybe set the expectations of how long this phased return might be.
Thanks. That's really, really useful. So Jess, shall we take our break now and be a good example to everyone?
What are the options around a phased return to work? Are there 3 different types of phased return to work? What do they look like? What are the options for when people are looking at what might best suit them? What are the different ways it can happen? Or is it literally like an infinite number of ways of like skinning the onion?
I think you've got to, there is a slight tailoring. I think phased return terms to be used in terms of time. And I would strongly advocate what Jas said about alternate days. I mean, I took that for granted, but perhaps that's something that people don't know. So definitely alternate days, whether you think you can manage consecutive or not. Half days of those days that you're going back in. Depends how many hours somebody already does. If you're full-time, as a really rough rule of thumb, you don't want to start on more than half your normal hours, but that's for kind of less prolonged conditions. So what you find with much more debilitating or prolonged conditions is that you need to start with even smaller. And I've been finding with long COVID, people are needing to start on 2 hours on 2 separate days, as little as that. So yeah, but so there are my previous rough rules of thumb, and then there's what happens with COVID. Yeah.
There's some wisdom in there, because if you use the traditional model of 50%, well, that's going to delay the employee getting back. Exactly. And that's good for neither party. Whereas if they start at a low level, then they're contributing something, and the employee feels good about it. The employer feels like, they're getting something out of it as well. And then, the process has started, and build it up slowly and flexibly.
Exactly. I mean, I think something's better than nothing. And I think particularly when a lot of organisations are going to have staff on long-term absence. And as you say, it has that positive build-up cycle for everyone. I just want to say I find it really interesting what Emily said about the coaching model, because that's exactly what I was kind of trying to imply with the language I was using that I would ask. And actually that sort of, okay, how confident do you feel, and what would you think would help to get you back is exactly from the coaching model and what we used to teach doctors when I was doing the National Health and Work project. So it's really interesting that it's really coming around to saying the same thing. So I think one of the other things which really helps a phased return in a prolonged situation like this is regular review. And I have that on good authority from, there's a chap called Professor Kim Burton, and Jasmine will know him. He's written the national guidance on this kind of thing. And, he would say that is one of the key factors in this prolonged situation.
Is there any literature out there at the moment around returning to work and long COVID?
Effectively, no. No, we've really got very little information at all. We've got a few surveys, I think there are 3 or 4 in the world, on how many people of a sample are still off work or are working reduced duties. And one of those was done by the TUC very recently, looking at nearly 4,000, but that's all we have.
Yeah, I mean, my data on this was I did a study at 12 months, so about March of this year, and I think I found something like 93% of people weren't able to work as they could pre-COVID after 12 months. Yeah. So, that's the scale of the problem we're looking at.
Yeah, and that's why when you asked me why I was so worried about it, it's exactly that, Yeah.
Asad.
Jasmine, so a lot of people with long COVID are low on energy. And, it's one of the cardinal features, I guess, of long COVID, where people have fatigue. And how can they conserve their energy better in a way that helps them to remain in work?
Thank you. I think the first thing is like we've spoken about, making sure that the duties that you're assigned and the pace of your work is appropriate to the symptoms that you have. But there are also things that you can do in your day-to-day working life that will make things easier. I think sometimes people maybe see sort of the cognitive demand of tasks and the physical demand as 2 different things. But my understanding of this is, you've only got one battery. And if you spend a lot of that on physically demanding things, then potentially you haven't got as much for if you were to attend a meeting, or if you were to have to spend a long time concentrating on something or critically thinking about something. For instance, if someone does need to do that, they need to synthesize, they have a job where they need to function and mentally process at a very high level, but at the same time are trying to maximize their well-being by walking 10,000 steps and using the stairs instead of the lift. These are the messages that we get all the time. We're bombarded with these messages, these nudges, because for most people, that is a good way to approach things. Improved activity is normally good for people, but I think with people who have fatigue, energy impairment, it's being much more mindful about that. And actually, if you're struggling with concentrating, focusing, task switching, it might be potentially that you're overexerting yourself physically. And so, for instance, a lot of my patients will say, oh, well, on a good day, I'll use the stairs when I go to work, or I maybe walk to work. But actually, having a good day is okay. It doesn't mean that you need to increase the challenge that day. It might just mean that you tolerate the working day and that you go home and you feel okay at the end of the day. You can spend time with your family and you can feel well. So I tell people to take the lift and to scale back their walking unless they have... they enjoy walking for their mental health and things like that. If really they're just walking for well-being, then I advise them to maybe scale it back a little bit and prioritize what they do to allow time for work. The other things people can do at work, energy conservation wise, is thinking about if they're bending, if things are on the floor or they have to walk quite far to get things, then can they be brought into a more convenient zone of reach? Can the things that they need through the day, are they accessible? People will sometimes have notes and files on the floor or in low filing cabinets, whereas actually if they were brought up to a higher level, that would be much less energy consuming. Thinking about trying to reduce the cognitive demand as well, if people can maybe work in a quieter environment where there's fewer distractions, again, there's less to filter. They can concentrate and maybe focus a little bit easier, but also they're not expending energy on that filtering process. I know some people leave out of offices on their emails and say, rather than trying to deal with all their emails through their day and potentially getting pretty stressed because they aren't managing to keep up with those emails like they would before, they may be leaving out of office to say, look, I will get to this email and I will get back to you as soon as I can. So that takes the pressure off a little bit and people aren't expecting an immediate reply. Some people are leaving answer phone messages on the phone and say asking for the person's name, number and what their inquiry is, so that when they ring back, they're a little bit more prepared. Other things, and I think someone mentioned earlier about just because it isn't normal doesn't mean it can happen. I spoke to someone recently who was a nurse on a ward, and one opportunity that she had to sit without it being a break would be to write care plans, for instance. But the nurses would normally stand to write care plans. The doctors had the space in the office or at the desks. There was no space to write, but that isn't an unreasonable adjustment to find someone a chair and a table that they could write on, and that would maximize their productivity through the day. It would be a chance to conserve some energy, recharge their battery. So like we said already, it's really looking at things differently, and just because it's always been that way doesn't mean it needs to stay that way.
You say it might not be a huge challenge to find a chair and a table, but in the NHS, that's bets are off the table. Emily, did you want to add something to that?
Yeah, I can attest to the difficulties of finding chairs. But I have my own wheelchair, which makes life a bit easier. So one thing I was thinking in terms of specifically for the return to work bit, when you're first going back to work, actually, is people are going to want to know, out of pure curiosity, especially because this is a kind of new and related to the pandemic. People are nosy enough at best of times, but also, some people will be genuinely concerned. And there is the potential for that real kind of sensory, emotional overload of a lot of conversations when you first go back. How are you? What's been happening? And especially if you're struggling with your mental health or coming to terms with what's happened, that can be really difficult to deal with. And actually, even for someone who has got a condition that's not related to long COVID, I still get on a weekly, if not daily basis, people asking about my health out of curiosity when they see me doing something differently or in my wheelchair. And it is tiring and it is draining. And I think having boundaries around when you talk about that is really useful. So being able to think, okay, if someone's coming to ask me, just saying, actually, I need to finish this at the minute. You don't have to answer people's questions. Having stock replies can be really useful. So a reply that gives a clear answer that you feel comfortable giving, but that doesn't lead to more questions, can be helpful. And then the other thing is thinking about whether when you either go to a new workplace or you're returning to work, you want to actually preempt it with an email or an update by someone else to let people know, let your team know what's happening. That can feel uncomfortable, and I change departments regularly being a junior doctor, and letting other people do that I don't particularly like. But equally, the times where I have had sent an email basically in advance just to say, FYI, this is my situation, it does save a lot of questions. So thinking about that could be worthwhile.
Yeah, very useful. Thank you. Jenny, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I think we haven't touched on sort of working from home. And I think obviously that isn't an option for all workers, but it can certainly be a way to kind of reintroduce yourself back to the workplace. Very often, if you've been out of work for a long time, there may be familiarisation things that you've got to do, there may be training. And in terms of energy conservation and kind of getting that feel back around working, that can be an option that might be valuable to somebody. Obviously, there are downsides to working from home as well. In my situation, I've got a very good ergonomic setup, electric sit-stand desk, laptop stand, forgotten the name of it there. And it can be isolating being at home as well. But I think it can definitely save on having to kind of get up, wash, dressed, commute to work. But certainly in the initial stages of kind of getting your feet back into the workplace.
Yeah, talking about downsides of working from home, we just witnessed one. Intrusion of little people onto into the screen. So, Emily, is there something that you could tell us about how people can go some way towards ameliorating the financial strain that being off work, losing your income or part of it, can put on people? Because you've got some experience with this. And I know that sometimes the forms can be quite challenging, and any tips you might have to help people about what the resources are and how best to go about claiming them, that'd be really helpful.
Yeah, so I think it's important to realise, and actually you may find that the doctors, certainly if you're speaking with GPs, may not be aware that certain benefits are available to people who are at work. For example, personal independence payment is something that you can very much be working and have, and that's designed for people with a long-term health condition or disability. And whilst that doesn't directly relate to work, it can allow you to have the support you need financially to get the adjustments in place, to get various kind of external support. Or, you know, as Jenny was saying, if you do find yourself needing to go down to reduced hours, taking that pressure off financially to be able to do that because of that payment being available can be really helpful. PIP is a difficult benefit. It can be very emotional. I would suggest ideally doing it prior to, not doing it coinciding with going back to work. It can be challenging because the system is set up in a way that it can feel quite, I think adversarial feels like the right word. I would strongly recommend that anyone applying to it looks at the point system for what each section that you might qualify for, and thinking about, so it's things like your ability to cook a meal, your ability to get dressed, to manage showering, all these sorts of things. And then there's a mobility section. So there's two separate sections. Without going into too much detail, happy to talk more about it another time, but really look at the point system, but also remember that just because you're going back to work or planning to go back to work absolutely doesn't mean that you're not entitled to it. And actually, if because you're working, you then come home and are unable to cook a meal or unable to have a shower, that is a state that means that you are unable to do those things. So you do still have that qualification on that point system. So don't ever feel that because you're working and you're doing certain things at work, that therefore you're not entitled to that allowance if by working your symptoms are more challenging. So the PIP is something that I would recommend looking at the website. I will give you the link to add in. There's a really useful not-for-profit website that gives resources on how to apply, and talks about things like whether you can do something reproducibly, safely, in a sufficient amount of time. So you might be able to walk X distance, but can you do it without ending up with severe post-exertional malaise? Can you do it within less than half the time? There's all sorts of little kind of details there that are worth kind of spending time on. There's also a charity that works called Fight Back for Justice that will help you with completing forms, particularly useful if you're struggling with brain fog, or certainly if you come to a point of a mandatory review or an appeal process. They can be really helpful because they have the experience. So kind of look for those sorts of support. In terms of access to work, Jenny's touched on that, and I think that's a really, really good resource. And actually, although it is still DWP, so Department of Work and Pensions, it's an entirely different experience. And some people are put off having gone through PIP. They don't want to go near DWP. And actually, often the assessors for access to work, in my experience, have a disability themselves. I can't guarantee that, but certainly many of the assessors that I've come across and colleagues have. So that's a really good resource. And for that, it's neither of these two things, PIP or access to work, are means tested. So it doesn't matter what your income is. But access to work can help you with equipment, that would be helpful, which can include working from home equipment. It can help with support services, which can include a job coach. And that's something that can be really helpful for, you know, these sorts of occupational questions of, well, what could you do and how could we adapt this, and actually having someone advocate for you. And also travel, which might be particularly relevant for anyone who, with the new potential changes to masks on public transport, or just because actually getting to work in itself is going to tire you out too much. If a medical professional can say that getting to work by public transport is not viable for you, either because of safety to do with COVID or because of your condition health-wise and your ability, that can be funded. And if you're worried about having this huge cost of equipment, etc., for your employer, it's important to know that the amount they contribute depends on how big they are. So the NHS, for example, is expected to contribute more than and very small organisations don't have to contribute anything. If you're starting a new job, in the first 6 weeks, if you apply, everything is paid for by DWP, but it's only ever the equipment. So support like job coaches and travel costs are always fully paid by DWP. So DWP for access to work is an easier one to start with, and you don't need to know what you need, because that's the point of the assessment. It's useful if you have some idea of what might help, but I hope that's helpful. And I think it's important to remember that actually, if you're applying for these things, you're applying for them so that you can get back to being as productive and well as possible. And actually, sometimes people have quite a negative view of applying for benefits, but if having PIP means that you can afford to get a taxi, which means that you can afford to do something productive, whether it's volunteering or even if it's a taxi to go to the shop to spend some money, you're still contributing to the economy. So allow yourself to get the help that you need.
Thank you.
Really excellent advice. Jenny, did you want to add something?
Yeah, just a couple of things with access to work. They also have support for mental health, up to 9 months support through 2 organisations, but it's run through access to work. And the recommendations, the report, it may be beneficial. We haven't sort of touched upon having somebody help you negotiate situations at work, for example, a union representative or a colleague or somebody that can go with you, because the access to work recommendations may not be taken up by an employer as well. So I think that it's worthwhile thinking about how you're going to hand over those recommendations for the kind of physical aspects. The mental health is a separate situation, but you get your own report from access to work and you then give that to your manager. And also just to mention that also covers people that are self-employed, because we haven't kind of mentioned people that are self-employed trying to get back to work, and they can access to work as well. So it's an excellent service. I've used it many times throughout my career, and the recommendations also now for me are energy conservation as well, if they're taken up, because they've indicated sort of Dragon software, so dictation software and those sorts of things. So there's a lot of benefits in terms of supporting someone with long COVID in the workplace.
I think there are a couple of things. People's prolonged sickness absence could likely be reduced in the first place by accessing proper assessment and symptomatic treatment, so treatment for symptoms, for things that we know that work. Now, the earlier this happens, the more likely we can avoid such prolonged things. So I think that's an absolutely key point here. And the second thing that we haven't touched upon is safety critical work. And a lot of people are in work which has safety critical elements, and those are things which have where the safety or lives of other people may be at risk. So anyone who works in the healthcare service, that clinician is does safety critical work, train drivers, bus drivers, you name it. So actually that is a separate issue, but we'd have to caveat a lot of what we'd said because with the cognitive problems that you can get with COVID, I think that needs special assessment, particularly on the job assessment. So I think that's something that's really important and has to be looked at.
Well, I have a question, which is the one piece of advice that you would give to somebody considering returning to work with long COVID, well, from having had long COVID and maybe somewhere in their recovery on long COVID, what would be the one piece of advice you would offer them? So starting off with Jasmine.
My key message would be to have realistic expectations of how much you can achieve and have an aim of feeling well. I think when wellness starts to deteriorate, that's when function starts to deteriorate. So if you think of realistic expectations, start small and aim to feel well, maybe score out of 10 how you feel, and make sure that that's maintained, a reasonable level of wellness, and use that as a guide when you're looking at progressing through your return or looking at a return to work.
Yeah, very good advice. How about Jenny?
Mine would be to seek support through peer groups around, what's helping and what's working people getting back to work, and also to draw on the long COVID support employment group resources, which would help people sort of make decisions and understanding.
Claire?
Mine would be actually rest in the very first few weeks, because this is an unforgiving virus, and I've said that before. And then I think, like Jasmine, expect that this is going to take some time. I think we know that now. So don't expect that you're going to go from 0 to 100. It's going to take probably weeks, months, or whatever, even in the situation where we can optimize treatment at the beginning.
I think maybe in terms of the post-exertional malaise that a lot of people with long COVID will be experiencing, which, just to clarify, is when you might be able to do something at the time and feel okay or not struggle with it particularly, but then it hits you a day later or even 2 days later when you're returning to work. Of course, keeping that in mind and just being really kind to yourself and not beating yourself up, not using the L word that is banned in my house. That's lazy. Get rid of it. And actually know that you will have days where you push it a little bit too far, because when you're in the moment at work, things are going well, you stay a bit longer and then you feel awful. That doesn't mean that it's all a failure. Just go back to your original plan, work back up. Like Jasmine said, it's kind of working back up slowly, but actually expecting that sometimes when you push things, either deliberately or not, that it will feel too much. And also comparing yourself to yourself a week before rather than to yourself sorry, I'm slipping in a second one now, aren't I? Comparing yourself to how you were a week before or 2 weeks before, rather than comparing yourself to how you were pre-COVID, which I know is really hard. I still compare myself to the 16-year-old girl that could do long distance running, and I'm definitely not 16, and that was a very long time ago. But it's hard to lose that identity. But actually, to see your progress, often other people will see the progress and you can't see it because you just see that you're not where you used to be. You can't do those 12-hour shifts anymore. But hey, you just did 2 hours for a whole week, and a month ago you couldn't have dreamt of doing that. That's progress.
Next in the series, we'll be addressing the time-weathered physical versus psychological debate for chronic illness, whether it's ME, CFS or long COVID, and exactly why it isn't all in your head. Till next time.